You can adapt stories and books in other ways too, simply adding visual supports and sometimes adapting the text to storybooks can also be really helpful. And again, like we talked about, this is helpful not just for the kids with autism or kids with developmental disabilities, but you think about ESL students in the classroom during Read Aloud, and they're often confused because their English skills haven't caught up yet, and they're trying to figure out what's going on, and they're trying to keep up. And now they're also very stressed because they're trying to keep up, which makes it even more challenging for them to understand what's going on. So these kinds of adaptations can help them as well. It can help the kids who have difficulty paying attention because it's something else to look at. We can adapt the physical books, certainly. We can also adapt books digitally. So I've made book adaptations before where I will scan the book and I will maybe cut out the real text and I'll rewrite the book with simplified text, or I'll add some symbols or whatever. The rule to that is, here's the copyright rule, because technically you're not supposed to copy books, they're copyrighted. Right? The technical rule is if you're scanning a book and creating a digital copy to provide access for an individual with disability, that is okay. But your digital adaptation is to stay with the actual book. So no, you're not allowed to go to the library, check out a book, scan it, return the book, and now you have this scanned copy, right? It's if you own the book, okay? Some of the things that schools have started to do in school libraries is to start making digital adaptations of books. And the librarian keeps little CD-ROMs of the files, or you keep them in a secure place where teachers can sign on and get one at a time, right? But the idea is that you can only use that when you have the physical book with you, right? Otherwise, it's illegal. And I'm not gonna stand here and tell you to do illegal things. Teachers make copies of things all the time, I know. I was one. But here's an example of sort of changing the text. So this was actually part of a home-based intervention. I was doing a PBS plan for a family around story time with a parent. So mom wanted to be able to sit with her child and do story time, and he was having no part of that. She'd ask him to choose a book, and I've got video of him running circles in the living room, giggling. And she's kind of, choose a book, and he's running around giggling, and there is no book reading happening. And then, if she picks him up and tries to put him on her lap to read, he's squirming and giggling, and again, there's no reading going on. So what we did is took a bunch of books that he liked, and I made these little sentence strips that kind of provided just the general sense of what was happening. So here, everyone in CAILLOU's family is getting ready to celebrate Christmas, Grandma and Grandpa are visiting, blah, blah, blah. They are decorating the Christmas tree, because that's what was happening in the picture, okay? And so the whole book was done like this. I used my sticky note glue stick. I could adapt and we could remove things later. And so when mom read the book, initially all she would do is read, they are decorating the Christmas tree. Look, the tree. Turn the page. And this was a kid who had minimal language, and most of his speech was echolalic. He'd just copy what other people said. One of the things mom wanted him to be able to do was answer some basic questions. So, touch the Christmas tree, or where's CAILLOU, that kind of stuff. So that was the next thing we added. And then eventually we got to the place where mom was reading all of the text and the child was reading this. It didn't take us very long before he actually knew words. And then I've got on tape as well where mom is reading the real text and she'd pause and point to a word and he'd read it. And then we were like, okay, well maybe he's just memorized the chunk, right? So she would turn a page, read nothing, and point to a word in the middle of the paragraph and say, what's that? And he'd read it. Right. Again, really smart kid, 4.5, wasn't even in school yet. But we needed to find a way to help him understand what was supposed to happen during book reading. And we had to find a way to help it make sense to him. And as soon as it started to make sense to him, he started paying attention, right? And then he started paying attention not just to the symbol stuff, but to everything, right? And that kid now reads like nobody's business. His latest thing, I was talking to his family recently, his latest thing is to watch videos on YouTube, and he transcribes them. They've got documents, pages and pages of documents of him transcribing things. Now, he's an individual with autism who is in fact still fairly challenged, and I'm thinking, now, well, there's a job for him, right? Like captioning video, perfect. Transcribing stuff, awesome. And apparently he's just lightning fast. 2 fingers, but lightning fast. But this is where it started, right? So who does this work? That's always the problem, right? If you're the classroom teacher, you do not have time. If you're the resource teacher, you probably don't have time. If you're a parent, you certainly don't have time. So how are you gonna get this done? Well, certainly there are volunteers, right? Oftentimes in schools, there are volunteers who are, sitting around taking lunch tickets or photocopying the announcement to send home or whatever. Sometimes those volunteers can do this. The other place I always go are other students. Now, adapting books, that's a great project for either upper elementary students or high school students. Showing them, here's the reading level that I need this to be at. Here are some examples. Here's a storybook. I want you to change the text of this storybook so that it's the same level as the example I gave you. That's a great exercise for other kids, more capable kids. Right? That's a great activity for them to do. It involves them being able to read, comprehend, and then restate or rephrase at a lower level, more directly, more straightforward, more simply. So that's a perfect activity that other kids could do, and you can get students making your stuff. So I've known schools that have the high school computer class learn how to use BoardMaker, and they scan books. They put the books into PowerPoint slides, they add the adaptation, maybe they record the audio, they save it as a file. If every student, imagine how many classes a day in a school, probably 5 to 6 periods a day, and if there are 5 periods a day of a computer class with 30 students in each of those classes, how many students is that? 5 times 30, right? If every one of those students did 1 book, how many books do we have? 150 books. We have 150 books adapted that could be in either the school library or the district library or whatever, and this could be one of their assignments. It's one of the assignments that they're graded on. Most high school programs have students that are in peer tutoring. There's a peer tutoring program. Those students, great for that. Or they have to do some sort of work experience. Also great, right? What about the high school students who are thinking, I might want to be a teacher or an SLP or something like that? Great students to haul in and say, here, let's teach you how to do this, and you can start some practice and think how good that looks on their university application when they go to apply to go into the SLP program or the teacher ed program or whatever, right? And at the end of the day, we don't have to do the work, right? So again, it's like win, 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 win. So I'm always looking for those kinds of things because time is an issue, right? We don't always have the time or the resources.
I'd like to ask a question on if we want to take our child to a play.
Yep.
Like the Gruffalo showing in March.
Yep.
And I have a hearing child, typical, and I have a deaf and autistic child. And I'd love him to see the play. And we have the books, he's seen the book, and I don't want to hire a TERP, an interpreter, because it's just too complicated.
Right.
So how do we do the same thing to prepare him before going to the play and during the play to bring some of those visuals?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's exactly what I've done in similar kinds of situations, particularly with deaf kids who may not watch the interpreter or understand the interpreter. I'll do all of that preview, have them watch televised versions of the play, look at stories of the play, I'll adapt some materials of the play, and then the other thing that I'll do is I'll bring a whiteboard with me, a whiteboarded marker, so that as things are happening, if I need to interpret something, I can interpret it graphically by drawing on the spot. So those are often the kinds of things that I'll do. And then I'll just make sure that it's a really nice visual play, like visually interesting, and not too much talk. Yeah, you're welcome. So that's the who part, right? The how part, what are the different ways that you can actually adapt the book? Reduce the difficulty of the content, right? Change the text, add symbols to the text, fewer words, shorter, simpler sentences, less text per page, right? That often is a bit of an area of difficulty. There's too much text and people kind of get lost in it all. Again, librarians are usually not happy if you glue things into their books or if you put Velcro into their books. I've found that that's not a good way to make friends with the librarians, so that's where your sticky note glue stick again comes into play. So if you've borrowed books from the school library or the community library, you can make your adaptations, use sticky note glue stick. Now you've got an adapted book, but before you return it, you can peel everything off. And then certainly scanner and projector if you're looking to alter books in a digital format and present them to a class. So when I was teaching deaf kids, right, one of the problems about reading storybooks to deaf kids is that if you're trying to hold the book and sign, it often gets really difficult. And when I had a class where some of the kids understood ASL, some of the kids understood no ASL, and one year I actually had a hearing student in my special ed class, so class of deaf kids, all with special needs. I had one hearing student who had autism, who had just arrived from China, who had come without a diagnosis, but clearly had autism. And so because he didn't have a diagnosis, he didn't have an aid, and he was sitting in this classroom of 30 hearing grade 6 kids not knowing what was going on, and I said, just send him down, we'll find a way to make it work. So he came. So if I'm reading stories, well, he doesn't sign at all, nor is he going to, because he's hearing. So I'd scan books, I'd project them, I'd have adapted text with symbols. I can now sign, I'd point to things on the page, so my non-signers, I can point, I'd use my voice, and then I had an aide working the computer, and so when it was time to go to the next page, the aide would just advance the slide for me, right? And so I could read it that way too. The other thing to think about are sort of the question and answer activities. So in classrooms, there's usually a lot of teacher Q&A, and our students often have difficulty with things like understanding what the question is to begin with, identifying the answer, finding the right answer, and then conveying it. And think about how quickly teachers expect this to happen. There's not a lot of time for students to think, and most of our students require more time to think, right? So often they end up getting left out of the question-answer kinds of activities. So a few general strategies. If we can, represent the questions visually. Can we do that, right? There's some software. So in BoardMaker, you can use a Symbolate feature where you can type, and as you type, symbols appear above the sentences. Writing with Symbols is another software program that does that. Clicker also does that. I've had situations before where I'll have an SEA sit beside a student with a laptop, and the SEA types what the teacher's saying, or types the questions, and then the student gets the visual representation, almost like a captioner, okay, so you can do that. Or maybe the teacher can pre-plan a few questions and have them visually represented. And then we think about, well, how's the child gonna answer? Is this a yes-no kind of kid, right? Can they answer yes-no questions if I phrase them that way? Or what if I ask a question but give them a set of multiple choice answers? So instead of them trying to figure out what the answer is, I give them maybe 2 options or 3 options. Or maybe they need a communication board with options. So here are some examples of ways we could do this. You remember the Napoleon story, right? So the teacher gave a lesson on Napoleon and is now asking some questions. Here's a picture of UBC. Is this where Napoleon went to school? That's the question. And this student had popsicle sticks, one with a yes and one with a no, and could hold up an answer, right? Again, all of the students could have yes-no popsicle sticks, and it's a way that the teacher could ask the whole class a question, and everybody holds up their answer, and the teacher can get a quick view of who knows and who doesn't know. Okay, so that's one thing. Who was Napoleon's mom? Gave the student a closed set of possible answers. Which one is the mom? If 4 options are too hard, we could go to 3 or 2, right? If I'm not even expecting the student to know who Napoleon's mom was, but what we're really working on is the teacher asked me a question and I need to respond, right? We're just working on the basic interaction. I might highlight the correct answer. I'm gonna highlight that in green before the teacher even asks it. And the student's job is to point at it or say it or whatever, right? The task at this point isn't, do you know the answer or can you identify the answer? Our goal right now is recognize that someone has asked you a question and respond in a timely manner. That might be our goal. It's nothing to do with Napoleon. We can also give individuals multiple choice questions where they fill in the blank. So this could be something that a student does as seat work or something that a teacher does on a smart board. So you could do this on a smart board where the student comes over and drags the correct answer, right? So if it's a classroom with smart boards, now we're just, again, presenting our questions in a different way, okay? And then finally, we can use communication boards. So the teacher poses a question, could be a whole bunch of different questions, but here's a board that has all of the relevant vocabulary, right? Because does the student need all of this vocabulary in his regular communication book? How often is he going to talk about Napoleon? Probably not very often, but he definitely needs that vocabulary during the lesson on Napoleon, right? So if he's able to discriminate the correct answers, we could give him a communication board. Now he uses that to be able to answer the questions. He has the vocabulary, right? Because if you don't have the vocabulary to answer and if you don't speak, how do you participate? You don't, okay? So those are different ways of helping with question and answer. The other thing that happens in classrooms a whole lot is this let's brainstorm, right? Teachers like to do lots of brainstorming. Really difficult for kids with developmental disabilities and autism for a variety of reasons. They may not know the topic that we're brainstorming about, so staying on topic is difficult. They may not understand what their peers have said, so they don't know what contributions have already been made. They may not have the ability to make their own contributions. They may not have the information related to the topic. They don't know what kinds of things to provide, or they don't have the ability to convey that information. So we can do a variety of brainstorming supports. We can make our supports errorless. And what that means is that I set up my supports in such a way that no matter what my target student offers up, it will be correct. I'm not going to allow the student to make a mistake. I know that you don't know about the topic yet, and that's not our goal right now. Our goal is about participating. So I'm just going to make sure that you participate and participate correctly. Or they could involve discrimination. So now I know that the student knows about the topic, or we've been teaching about the topic. Now I want the student to be able to discriminate a correct response versus an incorrect response and offer up a contribution that is appropriate given the topic that the teacher has set. So I've got a story for this one as well. Everything with me is a story. I had a student who was in a grade 2 class of deaf kids. She was diagnosed with autism. Her ASL skills were very emerging. She was learning to ask, to go to the bathroom or ask for a few desired items. She did not have a lot of ASL skills, and her understanding of ASL was also quite minimal. The teacher came to me because they were going to do a brainstorm about all of the kids' mothers to make a Mother's Day poem. And I knew that this student was going to have difficulty staying on topic, understanding what the topic was, understanding what her peers were saying, and coming up with anything to add. I knew that all of the things involved in this task were going to be challenging. So the teacher had come to me, and what they were doing was writing a cinquain about their mothers, sort of an adapted cinquain. So the teacher was going to ask all of the kids first to brainstorm words that describe their mom. This was part of the lesson. What are descriptive words? And then words of things that their mothers do. What are action words? And so she was going to get all these kids to describe these things. And then I've got my student who's, learning to ask for the bathroom. And she does not know about describing words and action words, and that's going to make no sense to her. So again, luckily, because I did a lot of work with getting teachers to come and let me know what they were going to do ahead of time so that I could make things for them. This teacher came to me and we sort of sat down, her and I, and made a list of what are the things that we anticipate students might say. We made the biggest list that we could think of. And then I made the grid of symbols. So I had a grid of describing words and I had a grid of action words, 2 separate pages, okay? We made one copy where we cut out all the individual symbols, and the SEA was going to use this during the brainstorming activity and place them on the chart. So all of the cutout symbols sat up on the chalkboard ledge. And then we had a sheet of each, a sheet of describing words and a sheet of verbs that the student was going to use during the activity. So we'd made 2 copies. Here's just an example of some of the words. These are not all of the words, but some of the words that we had for the student. So here were some of the adjectives, right? Funny, good, nice, pretty, smart, strong. And then here are some of the verbs that the student was provided with. So when the kids sat down to do their brainstorming, they're all sitting on the carpet. Instead of the SEA being on the carpet with the kids, the SEA was at the front of the room with the teacher, right? The teacher had chart paper, and the first thing that they were going to brainstorm were words to describe mom. So while the teacher is explaining about describing words to the class, the SEA brings the describing chart, the little page of symbols, over to our student and kind of goes through them, make sure that the student sees all of them, knows what they are, hands her that. Okay, boys and girls, now what are some words that describe your mom? Kids are raising their hand. So somebody says pretty, the teacher writes pretty, and the SEA is going through all of those cutout symbols, finds pretty, tapes it next to the word, so that our student knows what the peers have said, right? Because she doesn't have the language understanding. If our student had something to add, she'd raise her hand. She didn't have the signs, she didn't know the signs for any of those words. She'd hold up her paper and she'd point to one. Good job. We'd write hers up, we'd tape hers up, and so she participated in the brainstorming. Then when it was time for verbs, and the teacher is saying, now boys and girls, action words, blah, 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 the SEA came over and traded the describing words page for the action words page. And then they did the same thing. But we made it errorless. Everything that was on those grids were things that would be appropriate to go on a Mother's Day poem. So like ugly and mean were not choices, right? Because the student didn't understand what the final product was going to be, right? And the ugly symbol is kind of interesting looking. She might just pick it because it looks interesting. Right, that wouldn't make mom happy to receive that on Mother's Day. So it was errorless. She couldn't possibly make a mistake. Here's another example of an errorless grid for brainstorming. And this was for a student in a health class where the school nurse was getting kids to brainstorm healthy foods. And this student wasn't discriminating healthy versus unhealthy. And actually, if the student had options like cookies and cake and ice cream, would pick all of those because those were preferred. So this was errorless. No matter what the student chose to contribute, the health nurse would say, yes, that's right, that is a healthy food, good job, and write it on the list. For a different student who was able to discriminate, he had something that looked like this. So there were unhealthy foods on the grid, and he did need to be able to make the discrimination. And if he raised his hand and said brownie, the nurse would say, well, that's not really a healthy food. We can have a little bit of it, but too much sugar is not healthy, right? They'd have that conversation, okay? So that's the difference. That's what I mean by errorless versus discrimination, okay? But let's look at some of the other kinds of supports for activities, things that we're asking kids to actually do in classrooms, whether that be in groups or sitting individually at their desks and working. One of the things that I've used in my own practice and things that I recommend to people a lot are graphic organizers, and using graphic organizers as a way to help students understand information and also demonstrate what they know about whatever it is we're trying to teach them. So I'm going to show you some examples of a variety of different kinds of graphic organizers, from sorting and classifying to comparing and contrasting information, sequencing things, first, second, third, and describing as well. So let's look first at sorting and classifying and some of the things that we could get students to sort and classify. Often in classrooms, we're talking about characters in a book or characters in a novel or historical figures. So we could sort and classify attributes about those individuals. We could sort and classify attributes about settings in the environment. We can also sort and classify all kinds of other factual bits of information. So for example, this is something I had a student teacher come in and do with my class once. She did a unit on reptiles, and this was from her lesson on snakes. And this was Darren's work. And Darren needed to, for snakes, sort out the body parts that snakes have, the things that snakes can do, and the things that snakes eat, right? And he'd been involved in a bunch of activities, and in fact, we gave Darren a grid of symbols that required him to discriminate. Now, we didn't give him symbols for all of the categories at once. That was asking a bit much. So first we had him do, say, the eat. And in the eat, there were also things like hamburgers and French fries and pizza. So he needed to sort out what are the things that snakes eat. That goes in the chart. Things that snakes don't eat go in the garbage, right? Things that snakes could do, we had things like, drive a car, watch a movie, right? Stuff like that. And again, he had to sort things out, right? I had another student who wasn't able to make those discriminations yet, but was working on the difference between, say, body parts and things that one eats. And so that was the sorting that student was working on, just making the discrimination between this is a body part, this is the food, okay? So that's an example. I did this as a support for a student in a classroom where they were looking at the women's roles today versus the 1800s. And the teacher had a whole bunch of different things. Now these were sort of the simple things, right? The other students in the class were talking about kind of higher level things, but we had pictures of things that women did in the 1800s and things that women do today, and some of the things are still there. Some things have been added, some things have changed, right? Where they're not washing clothes in bins like this anymore. There's actually, right, laundry machines, hallelujah. But that was part of the lesson that the teacher was doing. They were looking at sort of the role of women across history. You could do sorting and classifying elements. So here are those elements in pictures again. Right, so you could use those cards in this way. What are noble gases and what are alkali metals? And how might a student actually be sorting these? By color, exactly the way that I would be sorting these, because I have no idea, right? I'm again one of those people that I learned something about the table of elements. I know that there is a table of elements, but that's about as far as it goes. But I had to sit through the lesson just like everyone else. But they can do sorting that way. Looking at comparing and contrasting. We can compare and contrast all kinds of information. We can look at characters from books and compare and contrast the different actions of characters or the different attributes of characters, the way in which they behave. We can do the same for historical figures, right? We could take different prime ministers over the years and compare and contrast their various attributes. We could look at comparing and contrasting settings or places, looking at things like natural resources. What are the natural resources in one place versus another place? What are the same? What are different? And we can also compare and contrast factual information across a variety of different topic areas. So here's an example. This was for a lesson on bugs, and this was color-coded to provide some prompts for the student. So the student had the two circles, blue and then green, and then kind of blue-green in the middle. And 4 of the bugs that fly and 4 of the bugs that walk, 3 of the bugs that walk, 4 of the bugs that walk, were color-coded to help the student know where things went. But we were working on having the student be able to discriminate between something that flies and something that walks. Not discriminate the both, but just discriminate one versus the other. And so we saved back a non-color-coded bug for each category. So we had the student do the color-coded ones first, and then gave the 2 non-color-coded ones as now what have you learned through the process of doing this sorting with prompts? Can you sort the last 2 correctly? And he could. Okay, so you can do that. If the student knows the discrimination, you don't have to color code anything, right? But color coding is something often that's quite useful, and it's a nice on-the-spot adaptation. I used to keep sort of a plethora of highlighters of different colors so that we could color code and make an adaptation that way, sort of in the heat of the moment, if we discovered that we needed it. This is another example of compare and contrast for cells. So this is something that I put together for a high school student who they were doing the lesson on cells and needed to compare contrast, so we did a Venn diagram. And again, if this student had needed it, we could have color-coded this to make it easier. And then a few years ago, I taught a master's cohort for UBC, but held in Victoria. And this is one of my students' assignments, and they did a lovely job. They had to take a children's book and do a whole bunch of adapting and come up with activities and whatnot. And they did Miss Nelson is Missing. And if you're not familiar with the story, Miss Nelson is this teacher, and her students were treating her kind of poorly. And they were sort of taking advantage of her lovely nature. And so she decided to be sick one day, and the substitute was Viola Swamp, who was really Miss Nelson underneath. And Miss Viola Swamp was not quite so friendly. And so after that one day, the students learned that perhaps they should treat their teacher more nicely. That was the essential message of the story. So what my students did was they took a whole bunch of characteristics of the two individuals and made an activity where students have to sort those things, right? And some of them are characteristics of both Viola Swamp and Miss Nelson, and some of them are separate, they're different, right? One was mean, one was friendly, right? So that's a way that you can do those kinds of compare contrast. So really, if you think about it, a lot of what we do in classrooms, we can break it down to some component elements, and for almost anything, come up with some kind of activity that our students could do that are related to the topic happening in the classroom, that also address some skill that we're working on for that student, and again, exposes them to the same general common knowledge that everybody is getting exposed to. Again, if I have to learn about Romeo and Juliet, why don't you? So should you, right? So we can do this a lot.